Well, we're just waiting for one more panelist. We'll get started, and he can, he'll have to reverse the order a little bit because he was number one on my list. But no worries. Anyway, thanks everyone for coming. Our name's Alex Wild. I'm the research director at the TaxPayers Alliance, and I've got to say that I've been really surprised by a lot of the media coverage in the last couple of weeks over this subject, because I couldn't even imagine that business rates would generate so much anger. It's been one of those sort of boring taxes that no one argues about too much, certainly not on the front pages of national newspapers, but all of that's changed recently. As I'm sure most people here are aware, the reason for that is principally that the revaluation, which typically takes place every 5 years, was delayed and is now we're revaluing over 7 years. And the result of that is there have been some very significant changes in rateable values, both upwards and downwards. And whenever we've looked at this issue as an organisation, we've tended to focus on sort of the multipliers, because we don't want to end up in a situation where we're not revaluing. I mean, what's happened with council tax has now got quite absurd. But equally, if we have these revaluations for every 7 years, we do get these very big cliff edges, which we want to avoid. But enough from me. We'll go across the panel, and from my right to my left, Ian Cass, who will be joining us very shortly, is the managing director of the Forum of Private Business, which is a non-profit business support organisation whose membership is spread throughout the UK, and is made up predominantly of private companies that have between 1 and 25 people. And on this issue, they've said that they think that business rates disproportionately penalise small firms. Then we've got Kate Nichols, the Chief Executive of the Association of Licensed Multiple Retailers. Their membership is mostly sort of pub, clubs, bars, casual dining restaurants. They're in 23,000 outlets employing about 650,000 people. So we're talking about places like Pizza Hut and Bill's, those sort of well-known chains. They also account for almost all managed pubs in the UK, and they have called for business rate relief because they're arguing that it's stifling investment. Then we've got Sam Bowman, who's the Executive Director of the Adam Smith Institute, which is a think tank founded 40 years ago that promotes free market and neoliberal ideas. And just today, in its budget wish list, the ASI has called for the government to replace business rates and council tax with a land value tax that funds local government directly. Next to Sam, we've got Alan Hawkins from the British Independent Retailers Association. He's the chief executive there. They've been around for 117 years and work with around 6,500 businesses. And they've taken a particular interest in a new appeals process, which is something that probably hasn't got as much coverage as the revaluation. So maybe Alan can tell us a little bit more about that. And then right on the end, we've got Sean Hughes, who's the landlord of the Boot in St Albans, and he's been fighting a vigorous campaign against the revaluation and has won the support of district councillors and thousands of other people who've signed a petition to Parliament. And Sean says that 80% of St Albans pubs face a business rate hike of 72%, which amounts to an average increase of around £27,000 a year. So we'll start with Kate and then move along. And each panelist is going to speak for somewhere between 5 and 7 minutes. And after about 5 minutes, I'll tap the table to sort of let you know where you are time-wise, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A from the audience afterwards. So, Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with an apology because I've spent so much time over the last 2 weeks talking about this issue non-stop that I am actually losing my voice slightly, so apologies for that. But I will do my best. One of the reasons why I'm here today is that pubs, bars, restaurants, the sector that I represent, and we go from single-site independent operators right the way through to the national chains and everything in between. We are already bearing a disproportionate share of the overall burden of business rates. We know that when you look at it in comparison to turnover, size and scale of the sector, we're paying more than our fair share already. And we have been particularly harshly hit as a result of the recent rates revaluation. In fact, we are the only sector of the economy that is facing across the country increases in rateable values. You'll have heard a lot of other people talking about concerns around office space, leisure, retail. They're facing increases in London in particular. We're facing increases across the country, and in all but 3 regions, those are double-digit increases, which is a very significant impact to bear for a small sector of the economy, and for a sector that is disproportionately made up of small businesses. So on average, pubs across the country are facing a 15% increase in rateable values, and restaurants are facing a 23% increase in rateable values. On average, that means that there's an uplift in their bills of about a fifth, which is a significant uplift for anybody to face at any one point in time. This year, though, however, the government has changed the transitional relief system, which means that most of those increases that are being faced by pubs and restaurants, and we estimate that half of all pubs and restaurants are facing an increase, despite what the Chancellor and the ministers are saying about the number of people who are protected and are seeing their bills fall. Half of all pubs in the UK are seeing an increase, and restaurants, are seeing an increase in their rateable values and their bills. 20% in most cases hitting in the first year, because the transitional relief has been tapered to such an extent that they don't receive it. And equally, we have seen reports from our members, places like St Albans, you've got 181% increase. Places in the southwest, they've been reporting 646% increases. Stoke, 347. This is not just a London problem as far as our sector is concerned. Why does that matter so much? Because pubs, bars and restaurants, eating and drinking out, is a critical sector of economic growth at the moment. It's worth £60 billion in turnover. That translates into 40 billion GVA for the economy as a whole, and we support 1.5 million jobs. And critically, a third of all jobs that have been created since the financial crash have been in the broader hospitality sector, eating and drinking out. So we're an engine of economic growth at the moment, and we're investing in our high streets and in our town centres and in our communities around 4 billion per annum in capex spend going into our communities, and 8 billion direct net contribution to the exchequer. So we're big business collectively, but we're made up of 80% of our businesses are small businesses. So they are struggling in this environment when they're having to face these average bills. So one of our bigger members, Wetherspoons, has reported that on average for their pubs it's going to be an £8,000 increase in their rateable value bills per pub. If you think about that, Wetherspoons might be able to evaluate that and measure it off across the country. For a small business in a small community, that might be the matter of staying open or not. It might be a bit difference between investing in a new member of staff or not, or it might be the difference between investing in a refurbishment or not. We estimate collectively together it's a £500 million additional bill that our sector is going to have to face. So we already bear a disproportionate burden of business rates. Our share of the increase that the government is looking to take is going to be disproportionately coming from pubs, bars, casual dining. And in comparison, we reckon about 18 pence in the pint, for those of you drinking pints of beer tonight, will be business rates for pubs, 2p per pint for a supermarket as a comparator. Why does it matter overall? I think it's partly that it's at odds with the government's aspiration of a low tax economy and saying that they are open for business. The government will say that they have cut corporation tax, and indeed corporation tax has decreased by half since 1990. In contrast, business rates have risen from a third of turnover of rentable value to half of rentable value in the same period. And my answer back to the government would be, you have to make a profit as a business before corporation tax cuts really begin to bite and help you. So we need to look at business taxation in the round to make sure that those businesses are sustainable. It matters to all of us as consumers as well, because if businesses don't have the margin to invest, they can't invest in their staff, they can't invest in training, they can't continue that investment in our communities. And pubs and restaurants and the high street in particular are vital tools of community cohesion. A third of a town centre's turnover will be derived after 6 o'clock at night, which will be coming from eating and drinking out businesses. So those businesses are vital to the health of our communities and the health of our high streets. And also it's that job creation narrative. If we've been generating jobs at the rate in which we've been going, if we suddenly have the shutters coming down and operating costs increasing so dramatically through business rates, which are the largest operating cost after labour that we face as a sector, then we can't continue that positive news story. And 3 things to finish with. What do we need? What have we asked the Chancellor for? We have a cliff edge, as you mentioned earlier, 1st of April, when the bills go out. We need immediate sector-specific relief. We're disproportionately affected as a sector. We need sector-specific relief. We need a phasing in of bills, we need a return to transitional relief that is effectively there, and we need a full right of appeal. At the moment, the government's proposals are that you will not be able to appeal even if your bills are wrong, unless your bills are wrong by more than a margin of error, and that's estimated to be about 15, maybe even 20% wrong. So if your business rates bill are wrong by that, even by a penny, it's too much. It's natural justice to say that you should have a right of appeal. We did some research last week about what that would have meant in 2010 if we hadn't been able to appeal. We estimate that for pubs and restaurants there were 17,000 successful appeals where the margin of error was less than 10%. That would have cost the industry 95 billion of unnecessary costs had that not been corrected. We simply don't have the capacity to absorb that again, so we need a full right of appeal reinstating. But for overall, what we really desperately need, that's the short-term help. This system is no longer fit for purpose in a 21st century economy that is predominantly e-commerce, or that has a large proportion of e-commerce. We need genuine root and branch reform, and we need an independent review set up as a matter of urgency.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, and came onto the appeals process at the end, which is something that I sort of learned when I was looking through this. And I think the quote is that the valuation tribunal for England will also be restricted, as they will now only be able to order an alteration to an assessment if it considers the rateable value to be, quote, outside the bounds of reasonable professional judgment,
Yeah.
end quote. I'm not really sure what that means, but
Well,
maybe...
the courts have argued in the past, when it's gone to a tribunal, reasonable professional judgment is a margin of error of about 10 to 15%. In some cases, they've come up at 20%.
Okay.
But basically, if you get two surveyors in a room to say, what is that, what can you rent that property at, particularly for pubs where it's a very subjective judgment based on how much do you think they can earn from that premises, which is a bit of an unfair way of assessing rentable value and rateable value in any case. But if you get two surveyors in a room, they will come up with different views on what that pub could generate in turnover. So it effectively removes your right of appeal.
Cool. That's what Sam, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks to the TPA for inviting me. I'm in the slightly uncomfortable position of more or less being at the Taxpayers Alliance to defend a tax, and the completely bizarre position of working for the Adam Smith Institute and being at the Taxpayers Alliance defending a tax. So what I want to talk about is, number one, why I think business rates are actually not bad as a tax. Number two, why I think they're still pretty bad. And number three, how we can improve them, and what other taxes I think we should be focusing on instead. So the main reason that I and lots of economists tend to think the business rates compared to lots of other taxes aren't that bad is that we think that they fall mostly on landowners rather than on the businesses that occupy the property. Like VAT, where the person who writes the cheque, in the case of VAT, is the business, and in the case of business rates is the business, the person who actually pays the money isn't always the same person. So with VAT, it's consumers who feel the pinch. With business rates, the price is factored into into rents, or into the land value. The theory is that the total cost of occupying the property is what matters to a business, in the same way that a Picasso painting the price of it is determined only by what people are willing to pay for it. There's a thick supply of Picasso paintings. There are 1,885, I found out recently, and the price is exclusively determined by what the highest bidder is willing to pay. Similarly, because the supply of land is fixed and the supply of commercial property is quite fixed, we should expect that the price of a given plot of business property is determined by how much somebody is willing to pay for it. Now, the business does not care what the makeup of that cost of occupation is. They don't care if it's entirely going to the landowner. They don't care if it's entirely going to the government. They care about the total cost of occupancy. So when one part of the total cost of occupancy rises, that is, business rates rises, the amount that they are willing to spend has not changed in total, so the bit that goes to the landowner has fallen. Now that's for theory, perhaps it's not true. In fact, the evidence is overwhelming that this is true. We have lots and lots of good evidence, both from in the most dramatic case, from the 1990 introduction of business rates in their current form, the first revaluation since 1973, which is kind of amazing when you think about it, and in the subsequent revaluations between 1990 and 2010. The Institute for Fiscal Studies looked at what happened to rents in the period after the 1990 introduction of business rates, and they found that even though across the board in the UK there was an 11% fall in rental values, it's kind of amazing, isn't it, to think about a fall in rental values. You know, that's, God, property recessions are an amazing thing to remember. Places that found that rates went up had rents falling by about 14%, even though the average was 10%, whereas places that found that rates went down found that rents fell by much less. So in effect, what happened was, when rates went up, rents went down. When rates went down, rents went up. It's exactly what the theory predicted, and it's exactly what happened. We also have evidence in a much more detailed and much more precise way from Dr. Nigel Mehdi's research into London, where he compared matched boroughs in London, where he looked at specific bits of commercial property in one borough, compared it to very similar bits of commercial property in another borough, and found what happened. Did what we predict happen? And yes, sure enough, within a couple of years, most of the capitalisation took place. In effect, when rates went up, rents went down. When rates went down, rents went up. Exactly what we predict in theory is what has happened in practice. And again, when the British Property Federation looked at the subsequent 1990 to 2010 revaluations, 5 revaluations I think took place then, they found again, when rates went up, rents went down. Now, that's in the long run. The question is, how long is the long run? Now, over those 5 revaluations, the BPF estimated that about 75% of the capitalisation of what we call the change was factored into rents within 3 years. So that's quite substantial, and that's quite a rapid change. It's more rapid than some people I've spoken to would have predicted, even experts in this, before they saw this data. So it seems that markets are actually quite good at pricing this in, perhaps because people anticipate the change before it actually happens. But 3 years is still quite a long time, and if you're a small business, that isn't really that reassuring. Well, your rents will fall next time you change your lease. So that's something we need to think about. There are lots of other problems with business rates as well. The biggest one, I think, is in fact that it's a tax on the property value rather than on the land value. Because what we do in effect is tax something that you can't really change, you can't improve, the land value, and something that is one of the most important investments you as a business make, the value of your property, the thing that's actually on the land. So we are combining quite a good tax, a tax on land, with a really, really bad tax, a tax on investment. And what we should be doing, I think, is changing that. There's also a huge problem, which is pointed out by Rory Meakin, who's standing at the back, which is the discrepancy in how we tax residential property and how we tax commercial property. In some parts of the country, in Kensington and Chelsea, which is an extreme, but still an example, there's a discrepancy of up to 100 times in how much as a landowner you will lose, in effect, in property value if you use your land for residential use versus commercial use, because council tax is so much lower that per unit than it is for business rates are. So that's a problem that we need to fix as well. And we have giant discounts for charity shops and things like that, which mean that the high street disproportionately favours those businesses rather than others. So how do we make it better? The first, I think, is to do revaluations much more rapidly. I think the huge sort of uproar that we're seeing at the moment is clearly because some businesses are seeing huge losses compared to others, and yes, it will take time for that to change. The irony, of course, is that if they get their wish and the revaluation doesn't happen, then next time the change will be even bigger and they'll be even worse off. So we need to do that much more rapidly. Number 2, we need to tax land, not property. The difficulty, of course, is in how do you value the unimproved value of land and how do you separate that from the property. But given that Zoopla can do it, I suspect we can figure out ways as well of doing that. There is an idea I can discuss in the Q&A if we have time about how we can do that. But thirdly, I think the most important thing is to focus on the taxes that really affect business. Business rates are a fixed cost for businesses. It's very good, with great respect to my colleague on the panel, it's very good that business rates don't make a distinction between profitable and non-profitable companies. Rents don't do that. Electricity bills don't do that. We do not want to penalise successful businesses to the benefit of unsuccessful businesses. We want tax to be blind to success because we want the market to weed out the unsuccessful businesses and to leave the successful businesses. So with that in mind, my point is that business rates are not the top priority. Yes, if we could cut all taxes, we would want to cut business rates. But given that we have limited time and we have limited resources about the taxes we can cut, we should focus on the ones that really do hurt business. That is things like corporation tax, that is things like stamp duty, which stop them from moving around if they own their property, and that's things like taxes on labour, like employer national insurance contributions. The business rates debate, I think, is a huge distraction. And yes, we can make the tax better, but focusing on cutting it or stopping revaluations is at best counterproductive and at worst going to make us a lot worse off in the long run. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Moving swiftly on to Alan from the British Independent Retailers Association.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening. Thank you for the previous two speakers who've put a good perspective on this tax. As the name British Independent Retailers implies, I'm rather parochial in terms of what I'm trying to protect, which is independent retailers. And independent retailers, by and large, are in the high street. One of the reasons why BARA is so much against the tax as it stands at the moment is because it is disproportionately unfair on those retailers trying to trade from the high street. It is unfair on all retailers in one sense, because retail or any property, any business that uses has to use bricks and mortar to make a living is going to be caught by this tax more than those who don't have to use bricks and mortar. So any premises that needs the bricks and mortar to operate from is disadvantaged by business rates, clearly. If you look at retail, and we tend to use GVA rather than gross domestic product for saying what it does for the economy, retail in a sense is 5.7% of the GVA of this country. That takes out the VAT implications. And it's paying 22% of the business rates bills of the country because it's an industry, retail, that requires property. At the other end of the extreme, you can have construction where you might have a big company, but most of the time they're out on site where the customer's paying the rates on the property that's been developed. They represent 5.9% of the GVA, not dissimilar from retail, but they're paying 0.1% of the business rates across the whole country. So it's a tax that hits retail. I don't like to split retailers from other retailers, but it also hits the high street more than the remaining retail. We did a research project back in 2015 showing that picking up what the Adam Smith Institute said, we're there to make sure that taxes don't disencourage good people. But the high street has been left with an unfair tax bill from the past, while retail has moved online and to other places. So retail has gone out of high street and it's gone out of town, but the government is leaving this tax traditionally with the high street, where it has been for many years. And we're seeing the online retailers picking up per pound of retail rates paid something like 1/7 of what a high street retailer would pay for their sales, for their premises. That's because they're often an online retailer may be treated as a warehouse rather than a retail premises, and picking up a much lower rate of value as a consequence. So we feel that it is hitting the high street in our research, and it's available on our website www.para.co.uk. Lists the premises we've looked at and shows that if you look across retail in general, for every pound of rates that an independent in the high street pays, the same multiple in the high street is paying 41 pence equivalent, 41% instead of a pound, and out of town about 50 pence, with online retail perhaps paying something like 16 pence for every square metre compared with the £1 that the independents pay because of these problems. They're often created by zonage. A small shop has to try and use every bit of its shop, so therefore they're caught mostly in Zone A, whereas a bigger shop that goes back a long way won't be totally Zone A, and they don't tend to use the Zone A as premises. They will not put exciting things in their window. They won't use the first few metres of the shop for trading from. They'll put counters and whatever there, and they trade from the back of the shop after the first few metres, so they're keeping their rates down. A small shop doesn't have the opportunity to do that. It has to use every square inch that it has got. We feel that business rates have been precipitous in causing some of the vacancy rates we've seen. Before 2007, vacancy rates in the high street were about 5%. They peaked at about 14% during the peak of the crisis in 2008 to 2010, and they're now 10% and rising again. And we feel the counter-cyclical effect of business rates is part of the problem. Business rates raise the same amount of money for government, whatever the stage of the cycle is. So if half the shops close, the government doubles the multiplier to try and raise the same amount of money from this particular tax. So it's totally unfair, and it's totally badly designed in terms of its cyclical nature. However, we sort of realised that the government was wedded to a property tax. We worked very hard in 2015 to see if we could get them away from a property tax, possibly to a sort of sales tax, although there might be intellectual arguments on sales tax, I understand. I don't think the government would have that because they saw it as inflationary. We saw that as stopping people who could manipulate prices abroad or take their margin abroad, and the government likes that you can't move your property to a low tax environment like Luxembourg or whatever, certain parts of your operation. You have to be where you want to make your money from. So we knew they were going to stay with rates, so we came up with an idea which we thought would help, which was the basic allowance that you're allowed to have, which up until this rating revaluation was £6,000. The government doubled it to £12,000 and rather put out the news that they'd helped all the small businesses by doubling the small business rate relief to £12,000. You should be happy. The trouble was it's a cliff edge. It's not quite a cliff edge at 12 because there was taper relief between 12 and 15. But why can't it be a personal allowance like your tax allowance? I don't know. Because as soon as you get to 15, that 12,000 is irrelevant to you. So when they say be happy retail, because we've given you small businesses in retail an allowance that's doubled, they forget to point out that the average business in our membership, or average retail business, has a rate of a value of something like £24,000. So it's not getting near the average. So it is helping some of the small businesses, and some of my members are happy who have got rate of a values below £12,000. I don't want to spoil the party for them, but we need an allowance rather than a cliff point. If that would make a massive difference, because if it was a £12,000 allowance, those who were paying on the average of 24 would have half their rates taken away, and they'd be happy as well. So it would solve the problem for the small people on the high street, the zonage of their premises, and that was the big change we were asking the government to do. Whether they half heard our story and doubled it to 12 but forgot to make it at the end of the cliff allowance, I don't know. I don't know how my time's going, but the other side of the coin is they're sort of talking that rates are coming down. The government knows what rates are doing because they're in charge of the VOA, the valuation office. They're not coming down for retail because retail is, the stories from my members out there is that they're going up significantly. The average, according to companies that we don't control, CBS, for example, saying the average retail increase is 8.4%. I'm picking up stories from the people who want to tell me, which admittedly are the ones who've got bad stories to tell, is that it's a sort of 20 to 30% increases in rates are not unusual, and they are not just London. I've got one today in a small shop, not in the centre of York. Hughes told me his rates have gone up by 24%. I've got an example from our magazines here. I'll just finish because I've got 40 seconds. These are shops around the country. Small dress shop here. The rates in their Warwick shop have gone up by 25%. Their Coventry shop by 56%. My president of the bar is sitting in the room over there. His rates have gone up by 32%. He's a London member. So it doesn't. I don't have to search very hard to find out what members are paying 32% or more in their rates increases. So the government saying that retail or small businesses are not losing out is not true. There's plenty of examples of small retailers who are losing. So our main thing would be made it an allowance of £12,000 rather than a cliff point of £12,000.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. And when I was looking at this, one thing I noticed is when you're talking about small business relief, you are talking about very small businesses, and also changing between the small business multiplier and the standard multiplier. There's very little difference in what they are anyway, so it's quite convenient at the budget to say, I think it was like 250,000 businesses are now going to be paying the lower multiplier, but in reality it really just it's neither here nor there really. Sean, if I can actually, are you happy to go now, or do you want to catch your breath and come back?
I wouldn't mind just catching my breath a minute.
Sure.
That's okay.
Sure. Sean, floor's yours.
Hi, we are just outside of London in a city called St Albans. It's a city because we've got a cathedral. Not that that's very important, but we've got a huge increase in our business rates. The rateable value for 29 pubs which are affected, the average increase is 72%. The Boots facing a 280% increase in their rateable value from 27,000 to 103,000. So these are huge figures that we've got to somehow work into our very small profit margin. We've got two pubs in St Albans. We've got a free house, and we've got the Boot's actually a Punch Taverns pub, so it's a Thai pub. As you know, the beer ties and things like that mean that we have a much tighter profit margin. So any increase of even a 1 or 2 quid on a pint, which we sometimes get from the Chancellor, and we haven't recently, but who knows. Does increase, but obviously decreases our profit because we struggle to pass the increase on the pint on to people without them just not coming in. Problems that pubs have got in particular is that less people are going to the pub. So when you're increasing their pint up even further, and supermarkets are keeping their at-home drinks much lower, it's just it's a multitude of different things that come in. It's going to affect us severely. I just wanted to say a couple of things on St Albans in particular. We knew this was happening around November time, but a lot of pubs haven't really had information from the government on the impact of what this is going to mean. We had to do so much work to put this campaign together to actually go into people's pubs and say, do you realise you've got a 120% business rates increase? And they're like, no, we didn't know that. So that's why we've had meetings. We've got a very active pub watch in St Albans, which has been useful. And we heard from Grant Shapps, who's a local MP from in Hatfield, that he reckons it's going to increase of £1 billion. So I don't know if that is the case, but with the increase in revenue from business rates this time, it has gone up. So there's a few things that we're doing. Anne Main's our local MP, and she has been very supportive with us. She's trying to get a debate this week, an urgent debate with MPs and then moving forward. David Gork is South West Hearts. He's the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. He's not answered us yet, but he's not really in our constituency, so well, not his constituency, sorry. So there's a few things. I mean, the Scottish Government, they put a 12.5% cap on pubs and restaurants, the increase. We would love something like that to happen here. I know, highly unlikely, but we just can't, when you're looking at trying to find like £40,000 out of your profit, how do you go about that when you've got a very tight profit margin? And there's a lot of our pubs that we've worked out that it's equivalent to having corporation tax of about 60% because you're going to take 60% of their profit just to pay the business rate. So you end up with a situation, a friend of mine who's got in St Albans, there's the 6 Bells, for example, their rates have gone up, rateable value's gone up to 70,000. The pub next door has gone down a few thousand to 20,000. So you've got these huge discrepancies on, like one business is pretty successful, the other one isn't so successful, but then that could be taken over, and the impact that's going to have on the successful pub could really damage that pub. You end up with these places that have a huge property value going from pubs to just turning into houses. We've already lost 4 last year, 2 in that particular area of St Albans. So the dangers are all there. St Albans has seen a massive increase in profits, property value. The average price for a house is 515,000 now, which is 300,000 more than the average in the country. That impacts us being able to keep community pubs. All the pubs in St Albans are kind of in the back streets, and it's very much part of the community. So if we start tackling the community in that respect, you're not just losing somewhere to go for a quick pint, you're actually losing somewhere that local musicians can meet up, local groups can meet up and have conversations. When people move, a lot of people have moved to St Albans from London. So they come into the pubs, we introduce them to other people, and it's a real nice community feeling. If you start attacking all of that, we just end up with a very, very boring area in general. So that's it really from me. We are looking at the boot. I thought I'd put this one together. We worked out we need to sell 22,000 more pints a year to pay for our tax increase, which is huge. So it's about 60 odd pints a day. So I don't know if any fancy's coming up there. 60 of you a day, that would be great. We might do you a deal if it's before 3. But that's the reality. Towns outside of London, it's not just London that's increasing. Towns outside of London are having a lot of changes. A lot of the way pubs are used is changing, and not many people go out at lunchtime now. But when you're turning into more of a commuter city, like we are, you need to try and sell another 22,000 pints is somewhat impossible, to be fair. And all it means is that we're going to end up losing a lot of our history and heritage. The boot, for example, is nearly 600 years old. It was the first battlefield pub because it was built on the first Battle of St Albans, which was the War of the Roses, which started outside. So we've got a battle on now with the tax man, but we've got a lot of history. We've got the oldest pub in in the country, the Fighting Cocks, which is having a huge tax increase on their rateable value as well. And most places are. And I think I picked up on earlier where you said something about Wetherspoons obviously having £8,000 increase. Well, St Albans, the Wetherspoons has gone up over 110,000. So it just goes to show when you're a big company, you can split it down to 8,000 per venue. That's not great, is it? But I mean, it's better than having what we're facing individually. So yeah, we've got a lot going on at the moment, especially with Punch Taverns having different takeovers and all of that fun. But you know, at the end of the day, we just want to concentrate on running a good community pub. We've got a great pub scene in St Albans. If you've not been up there, I'd highly recommend it, especially as we all need to sell a lot more beer. But yeah, that's my point.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you very much.
Ian Cass from the former private business has joined us and hopefully caught his breath and the floor is yours. I said sort of between 5 and 7 minutes, but I'll give a tap on the table when you get to 5 so you know whereabouts you are.
Only 7 to cover this one. That's good evening, everybody. Sorry I was a bit late. The tubes weren't kind to be coming down from Manchester. I don't know, it's interesting that this is now a hot topic because a lot of the business organisations have been shouting about business rates for years to absolutely no avail to any government, huge tax benefit to them, and nobody's been willing to do anything. But something's happened last week. Maybe it's the 7-year gap, and some of the hikes, particularly in the south, are massive. There's no doubt about it. What we shouldn't forget is also there's a lot of other places, particularly in the north of England and certain other towns, where the business rates are going down. But from my point of view, it's interesting talking about the pubs. I used to get paid when I worked in the drinks trade many moons ago to go and look at areas and find what were the coming areas in any city, usually the places that were starting to develop. And if you go back longer than I care to remember, you know, Clerkenwell, Shoreditch, nobody really wanted to go in there at all. Anybody who knows Manchester, Oldham Street, the northern quarter, dead as a dodo, and nobody wanted to go in there, the gay village in Canal Street. And what you tend to find is it's the independent retailers that help to redevelop those areas. They're the first people that go in, the independent bars, the independent shops, those independent retailers. And they go in and help to revitalise that area. Then you see flats being built in old warehouses and the whole area comes up. And lo and behold, 5 years later, you get stung with a massive business rate increase, which doesn't in any way trade off against the amount of business that you've seen coming in. Now, from the forum's point of view, the majority of our 12,000 members are all independent, private and family firms, really, all that employ people. So we're dealing with the independent trade. If we try and get business rates right and we tinker with it and we put sticky plaster here and we put pots of money there, it's not addressing the fundamental problem, which is business rates don't work. They haven't for ages. This is a modern world we're living in. Things have changed, online retailers, there's a lot going on. The government have got to have a grown-up conversation about this and decide what they want our high streets to look like. That's the key. London will survive and Manchester will survive, but the Kingstons, the Knutsfords, the Northwiches, all these places, where you go into them and you will all be the same wherever you live, you go through those regional high streets and they're dead. There's shop units not open, they're not doing terribly well. There has to be a conversation that says, do we actually want a diverse and interesting high street with these retailers on? And don't let anybody kid you that the demand isn't there. Because again, I'm sure wherever you live, look at these artisan markets they do on a Sunday. They're absolutely filled with independent retailers and they're filled with people that want to go to them and buy products. How do we get those people onto the high streets? But that conversation has got to be had and we've got to decide, do we want a vibrant, diverse and interesting high street or not? Do we want it full of large chain operations, turning retail properties into flats and charity shops? Because that's what we'll end up with. Or if we do want a more diverse high street, and I hope to hell we say we do, then we've got to find a way of making it easier for those independent bars and retailers to trade. Now that might be a case of, you know, in your first year of operating you get a 20% discount, and for every year that you stay on the high street more comes off. I don't know, I'm not a tax expert, but there's got to be a way of rewarding and encouraging those independent operators that could run retail shops, interesting bars, all that kind of thing, onto the high street. But it needs an intelligent conversation first, in my opinion anyway, and I think the forum's opinion, about what we want the high street to look like. Not just going, business rates looking a bit broken, we'll just have a bit of a tinker with it around the edges, stick a 10, yeah, that'll do, that'll see us through. We've been making that mistake for years. So now that this conversation is happening, I hope to hell that the government take it seriously. They've renamed the business department Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, but perhaps part of their industrial strategy should be to look at the UK's high streets and decide what they're going to look like. It's my opinion.
Thanks, Ian.
Cheers.
Bit of extra time. So I'm going to nick one question, which is a pretty factual question, is if we accept that, what Sam was saying, that in the long run we expect to see, rents adjust, but we've got this sort of transition, period where potentially, your rents might go down by the time you get to the end of your lease. What is the sort of average length of a lease on a commercial property? Because I've been trying to find this out and I can't really find any statistics about it. I mean, what's it like for an independent retailer or, the kind of businesses that you guys are
It used to be sort of 21 years with 7-year breaks, but it's much shorter than that now. It's,
Yeah.
I would say 10 with 5-year breaks.
Okay.
Often, the frequency of lease renewal has been, the length of a lease has been reducing in lots of other sectors.
Okay.
The one sector where you still have long leases is pubs, bars and restaurants, because
Interesting.
you are putting in an awful lot of money when you go in order to refit it out, to refurbish it, to take it on, to maintain that property. You need a long lease in order to get a return on investment over that same period. So in our sector, it still tends to be the old-fashioned 20-year leases. In other sectors, they've gone down to 3 years. So if you've got a 3-year lease, you don't have a rent review because you are looking at lease renewal every 3 years. And increasingly, it's 3 years and it's outside the protection of the Landlord and Tenant Act. So you don't have a right of renewal for commercial property. So you will find that you can get that adjustment in 3 years, because if your rents are going down or the demand for property is going down, your rents will be reset. In our sector, they're long leases, they do have rent reviews, and in the commercial property sector, they have upward-only rent review clauses. So you have this ever-escalating spiral that causes you problems on the high street for pubs and bars and restaurants, because you've got a long lease, the rent only goes one way, you never get a chance to have the rent readjusted, so therefore your business rates don't readjust, which is why we bear a disproportionate burden.
Okay, thanks for that. That's really interesting. I didn't know that. I was trying to find out today, but I just thought I couldn't.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for
But
that. That's
the
very
British
interesting.
Property Federation is saying that increasingly now you are moving to 3-year leases for office and leisure and retail space.
Okay, thanks very much.
Historically, because I don't know why, but historically there's an awful lot of releases coming up in the next 3 or 4 years
Yeah.
as well for
Okay.
renewal. So if anybody does want to jump, there will be more opportunity to jump in the next 3 or 4 years than any other time. Because
Yeah.
just because your rate's going up, you still might be contractually tied to your lease, but your chance to say, oh, hang on, this isn't enough, I'm going to move on.
Yeah.
There'll be more businesses have that option in the next 3 or 4 years than normal.
Yeah.
So I was down to perfect time to revalue that.
I was going to add, in the industrial sector, similar sort of picture, which is
Absolutely.
10 to 20-year leases,
Yeah.
and again, upward only,
Yeah.
Okay.
which means that Sam's fine academic point doesn't apply.
Yeah, I mean that's where you get the problem of, you look at it globally and you might see some readjustments, but in sectors which are property intensive and investment intensive, you don't get any offset from the investment that you make in plant and machinery, whether that's a kitchen in part or whether that's Port Talbot Steelworks. And if you are on an upward only rent review clause in your lease, your rents cannot come down at any point. You can't readjust even if the market crashes.
Just
Sure,
briefly,
just gonna have some little
briefly
bit
on
of
that, the industrial sector, just looking at the government's estimates, is going to be seeing a 6% across the board reduction. So it's actually in the industrial sector's favour that rents can't adjust up. Rents should actually be going up for the industrial sector, but the point you just made is actually good for the industrial sector.
On this occasion, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll open it up to questions. If you can just say, give us your name and if you're representing a business or a trade body or an organisation. Yeah, gentleman, just that. Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Guy Lachlan. I'm an independent retailer off High Street in Buckinghamshire. I don't know if it's really a question, but a comment to Sam about, I think it was a good effort at defending the indefensible. I think you missed out 3 critical areas, which is your thesis, I think, would work if it applied to the entire marketplace. But in retail especially, you're not just dealing with competing against the guy across the road. I bought a bicycle like the other day and by accident bought it direct from China. Now they don't pay business rates, and that sale, a loss to a UK business. It doesn't take many of those, a much percentage of loss of sales, to make the business totally not work. So I would almost buy your point if business rates were a worldwide thing. But those of us who aren't, selling haircuts or manicures or even beer actually, we're competing in a global marketplace now. We're not competing against people paying with the same tax base. And I think that's an important point. The second one is we're seeing, certainly in Lux, we're seeing an increased exercise of permitted development rights and huge amounts of previously commercial properties being converted for resi. And that must have a massive negative impact on the total tax take for the government. Because as I think you said, there's a disproportionately low amount being paid by residential compared to commercial properties. And then thirdly is this one that keeps on being brought up with this, which is the unquantified social value of these real businesses, which are becoming more and more scarce and perhaps will become extinct in some areas. And I think somebody's trying to put a pound note value on that to try and establish what the social cost would be to our economy.
Sure. Do you want to?
Sure. So thank you for your points, which I take seriously. I think we have heard two problems, and they are both problems, but they're not compatible. One is a dead high street. The other is very high rents. Now they're not compatible because if rents are high, it's because demand for the properties is high. So with any pub property, with any property, if a business is unable to pay its rents, it's because another business wants to occupy that property and is willing to pay more than the current business is willing to pay. Now that is a problem for that business, but as a consumer, that's actually not a problem at all for me. In fact, it's a good thing if the business is displaced, because it means that there's a business that can do a better job of satisfying me as a consumer than the one that's there at the moment. I want that business to be pushed out into another unit. So it's also the case that there are many dead high streets, but that I think is not really explainable by excessively high rents. And remember, of course, that business rates are largely determined by rents. They are, of course, revaluations don't happen often enough, so there is a lag, but they're largely determined by rents. All of this ignores the point that I was making, and I think that we need to remember it's fundamental that rates are actually just coming out of rents. And it's kind of assuming for the sake of argument, because in the short term maybe they don't. When we hear about the kind of lost UK business, I don't think buying things from abroad is a lost UK business, because I think that we sell things abroad as well, and I think that we buy things in other ways. If you're buying a bicycle more cheaply from abroad, that means you have a cheap bicycle and you have some more money to spend elsewhere in the UK, and people from abroad are buying things elsewhere in the UK. I really don't buy the kind of, I'm not associating you with him by guilt, but the Trump idea that we're losing when we're buying things from abroad. We're not, we're winning. But the really, really important point to remember here, though, is if a business can't pay its rental bill, it's because another business can do its job better than it can in that particular space. So it is not a bad thing for society, even if it is a bad thing for that business.
Cool, thanks. So I can go, sorry, I'm going to overrun by about 10 minutes on this if it's all right. So I've got about 20 minutes, there's plenty of time, but I'll just go to Corin here in front.
Corin Taylor from UK Onshore Oil and Gas. So we've got experience in the minerals sector, business rates, and a quick comment and a question. And the comment is, we have revaluations the same as everyone else, but part of our business rate is based on the price of the oil and gas that we sell, which is set on 1st of April 2015 for the next business rate period, which is run from 1st of April this year to 1st of April 2022. Now, oil and gas prices have fluctuated quite a lot. They've gone down by about 50% since the last business rate period, but there's no mechanism to change that. So it would clearly be a good idea to have an annual revaluation of this. So why haven't we got one? Because it's obviously a good idea for lots of sectors to do an annual thing. Is it just bureaucracy doing it? I mean, so why hasn't it been done before?
It's been asked about by the Treasury and the valuation office, and it's a question of resources. They're doing the revaluation at the moment. For all the pubs, bars and restaurants in London, there is one person who does the valuation for that. So you are looking at an overstretched, over-resourced. It's no surprise that mistakes get made in valuations. My colleagues are here in the front row, we had meetings with the valuation office when they were looking at the revaluation methodology to use for pubs and bars. That one person was on maternity leave. You know, it's a sort of, I think there is a crisis there, and I think the government has looked at, do they do annual, do they do 3 yearly? What's the burden on the business to provide that level of information to keep it up to date, and what's the burden on the valuation office to be able to deliver it? In addition to the point about how frequent the revaluation happens, you need to narrow the gap between when the revaluation takes place and when the bills hit, because that's arguably the more important bit, because we're still talking now about a time lag. So we're still talking about that bills that are set now based on assumptions about demand, market conditions and the economy that were pre-Brexit.
Yeah.
And we all know that the whole nature of the landscape has changed irrevocably for all of us who are doing business, and you've got growth forecasts that are reduced. So this idea that, you know, rents will adjust themselves, they haven't, they're fixed. You're locked in, you're at that point. You can't just go back and re-argue that those rents should be reduced. And rental levels, as we said, in our sector and presumably in some of yours, will be only going one way.
But I mean, do you even need humans to do this? I mean, something like the oil price, you could just, like, I could find the price of a barrel of Brent crude on my phone in 20 seconds. I mean, maybe there could be some kind of automated index, and the BOA would just be like an appeals body or something like that.
Again, that's one of the things that government is looking at.
Yeah.
Do you do self-assessment as businesses? Could that work? It's hugely complicated. There's, Alan was saying earlier, you know, for retailers, it's not just a simple square footage bit. It's what's your prime trading from, what's your back, what's basement, what's storage at the back. So it needs to be totally ripped up and a new system put in place. We need a consultation on that. You could look at all of these things. You could look at automation, but you know, you have to then come up with a simple assessment. In pubs, it's a hypothetical assessment of what we think you might be able to trade from that premises, which means you might always be overtaxed, or you might have somebody who's undertaxed. But that can only be done by a human being making a very subjective judgment. So until you get a system that would work, you can't automate it and speed it up.
Can I just come back on a point on that? There's roughly 1.8, about 1.8 million premises that need to be in the whole rating industry that need to be done. If you took £18,000 as a cut-off point for whatever you're doing, you'd only be left with 25% of shops, 26% of offices, 25% of warehouse, and 22% of factories. So the way you get more frequent valuations is to exempt the lower end. You can get rid of 75% of all rateable values if you made 18,000 a rateable value. So the government would then have the resource left to do the remaining 25%. While it leaves everybody in the pot, it's leaving itself with a massive job to do. So there is a benefit to me, but also a couple of problems there.
You might find then that the sectors that are in higher rateable value premises, like independent pubs, would be the ones that were bearing even more of the burden.
I'll just answer the question technically in terms of the number of premises.
Sam, just very quickly on this, and we'll get another
The
question.
problem, I mean, this kind of tells us why, even though I think business rates are all right, it's really important to remember that they are a tax on the property, and it's completely mad. I mean, I don't care. I could not care less if a given plot is used for H&M or for a pub or for offices. It doesn't matter to me as long as it's being used for the most productive use. But the fact that we have completely different approaches to doing valuation, and the fact that we penalise someone who puts the most investment into that piece of land, it's completely mad. So the system does need to change, but not in the way that most people are saying. I completely sympathise with retailers who object that their bills are going up. But if the value of the land is rising for retail space, then your bills should go up. And it's completely right that firms that use non-valuable land, like Tesco or like Amazon and farms and things like that, should pay a much lower rates bill. You know, imagine if we had farms in the middle of London. It would be completely crazy if we were continuing to exempt them from business rates. We would want their business rates to be very high. We would want them to be driven away from central London to non-useful parts of the country. And that's kind of what business rates do. Not perfect, but that's kind of what they do.
But wouldn't you get cross with the out-of-town retailer who was doing the same customer fulfillment, sending the same product to the customer from a premises that's rated as a warehouse rather than a retail premise?
Which is why we need to switch to land.
That's nothing to do with an intellectual argument. That's just a pure
Switch to land.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. But
Switch to land.
Okay.
But the point is that it's not a huge tragedy as a consumer if what once was a retail space that has been driven now out of town, and now it's a pub or a cafe or something like that. It doesn't matter that much if we don't have retail spaces in towns, if that's not what people are actually paying for and actually want.
Okay, we'll go to the gentleman. I'm going to get two in now. The gentleman there and also the gentleman at the back.
Yeah, Charles Oliver.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I couldn't see your hand. All right, we'll take three then, but just this gentleman here to my left first, please.
Yeah, Andrew Smith. I work in the city. I live in Epping, which is a market town just outside London. We're suffering some of the effects of gentlemen over here. What's happening in Epping is that there are relatively few private landlords who control a large proportion of retail premises and pubs in the town. They bought them up over time. They are keeping rents artificially high, by which I mean they're keeping premises empty but still asking a very high rent if someone goes along offering to rent the premises. Why do they do that? Because they want to be able to go to the planning authority and say, I can't let these premises, please let me knock it down and build a block of flats.
Yeah.
Okay.
So or convert it. So we're getting the part of the town ripped out. It's being turned into just a series of blocks of flats, and there is no community spirit there at all.
Okay, thanks. And the two gentlemen at the back. The gentleman sat down there. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I'm Charles Oliver. I belong to a club in St James's. Now, in 2005, the rating value was 137, 2010, 176, 2015, 580. That is a multiple of nearly 4.25 times. How on earth can anybody justify that? I don't know. They must be completely mad. The rate of inflation has not gone up under what inflation has been in that time. I don't know. The government should work out the collateral damage that is done by people closing down, having to lay off staff and that sort of thing, because there is a lot of collateral damage. Somebody should have the common sense to work out, if they're going to introduce a tax, what is the damage going to be? How many people are going to be unemployed? How many businesses are going to be no longer there, and so on. And they can't justify that sort of increase. It's ridiculous.
Okay, I'm just going to get one more question, then we'll let the panel respond to these. So, Lance.
Yes. I tend to agree with Sam, apart from the one point where you talk about industrial rates going down by 6%. I run a manufacturing business in London, our rates went up by about 30%. But other than that, I do tend to agree with you. In my particular industry, our costs of our raw material have gone up by 100% in the last year. Nothing to do with Brexit, I hasten to add. And because that's happened across the board, we've passed on those costs to our customer by increased prices. I don't know whether a study has been done into the rates increases as a percentage of turnover throughout industry, but I have no doubt in my mind that the businesses where rates have increased are in areas that have been successful and are growing and gentrifying and so on, and they will be able to pass on those costs to their customers. Everyone hates the idea of putting their prices up. I suspect they will be able to put them up. I also suspect that the government is quite keen for a little dose of inflation because it will help wipe out the debt. And I agree with you on the key point, which is that this is a fixed cost. The way that government can help business with taxes is reducing corporation tax. And I find it very bizarre that our Chancellor made a statement a short while ago threatening the EU that if we don't get the deal we want, we're going to be dropping corporation tax to whatever it is, 10 to 15% or whatever. If it's a good idea, we should be doing that anyway. And that's what I think we should be doing. Because rates, I suspect, will be a very small part of, I don't think prices will need to increase that much to cover the rates costs.
Okay, you can just pick and choose from what you've got there, and maybe sort of a minute each on the panel, because I would like to get a couple more questions in if possible. So do you want to go first?
Yeah, I was just picking up on the gentleman at the back actually. I think the biggest problem we've got with it is it's very easy to say yes, we can have these increases and somebody else will come in and pay, we can have other chains taking over our pubs, we lose that. It's about what for us this is about, is the independent local community aspect that is being utterly obliterated in favour of big chains that can afford to spread their costs across the country. That's where I was kind of wanted to make that point.
Do you mean big chains like the ones that Kate represents?
Yeah, not just big chains.
Even my big chains are not huge. The biggest restaurant chain has 70 sites. We're not talking Tesco here. The biggest pub chain has 800 to 900 sites. These are not monstrous corporate giants, and they're all tiny net profit margins.
Yeah.
So if you adjust the net profit margin on a Wetherspoon's pub, it will close, it'll go out of business. I don't know whether anybody saw recently, Jamie Oliver announced he was closing 6 to 7 restaurants. That is down to business rates. That's nothing to do with Brexit. It's down to business rates. Well, you may say that I couldn't. You may say that I couldn't possibly
new
comment.
restaurants too, actually.
But there are, in certain areas, people will take a long hard look and say that the cost model doesn't work out. And you know, you're saying about you might be able to pass the cost on. You might if you're in a relatively high margin business, or you're talking about big prices. If you are in a cash business, which is what Alan's members are, Sean is, my members are, you're talking about very low net profit margins of about 4 to 6%. You are talking about things where tiny changes make a big difference. And you've got national living wage, apprenticeship levy, business rates, pensions auto-enrolment, all hitting. None of those things could you have predicted. 18 months ago, if you were sitting down in our sectors, looking at what might happen in the future going forward, you did not know any of those things were going to happen. The Chancellor pulled those rabbits out of the hat and gave the businesses 4 to 6 months to adjust. That's no time at all for a business to be able to get their head around it, and certainly if you've got a very tight net profit margin of the kind we're talking about here. And you know, you're talking about average spend of less than £10.
Properties.
Commercial property, I mean, yes, I mean, the people will hang, our landlords do try to get different planning uses for their premises to make commercial gain, and I take the point you're making, but a lot of landlords also, I suspect, have portfolio that they are hooked up to their banks for, and they can't afford to see the value of their portfolios come down. So we see a lot of manipulation of rents from a true market, in a sense, in the Adam Smith sense of the world, because landlords will want the rent to be so much per square foot, but will give you a 2-year rent-free period. Anything to keep the notional rental rate of rental value up at a certain level, so that the perceived value for anybody else coming to that high street is that premises rents at £250 a square foot or whatever, and it creates a false market. So for both those reasons, the one I agreed with and the other reason, the rent market isn't perfect. In terms of margin, I mean, I'll go back to the internet point again. I mean, if your competitors are online dealing on a different cost base, in the same products, you'd be in trouble passing it on. So it's not a pure market in terms of what you're talking about. But typically, a retailer will be on a 40% margin, and about a third of that is going in the rent and rate cost. Labour is the only big cost. So a third of your gross margin is going in rent and rates, whatever the combination is between the two, and however they might go together over time. If you start playing around with that with a factor of 1 or 2%, the average shop is making a bottom line profit of about 3%. You wipe it out by the time you start playing around with those two by 3%. So no wonder that is causing the sort of vacancy rates that are out there in the high street.
Yes, Sam, do you want to?
Yeah, the point you're making, I'm really interested in this because I think it is so important. It undermines, firstly, the importance of understanding rates as a tax on landowners rather than a tax on renters, and secondly, is understanding the importance of this residential and commercial distinction. In my own house, I pay about 10% of rent on council tax. If that was a commercial property, I'd be paying about 50% on rates. Now, if I don't know it, but if I did, then there would be a very obvious preference for me, if I could rent that out, to have it in council tax rather than to have it as for business use. If that falls on the landowner, as I believe it does, and I think the evidence shows us it does, then there's a huge bias in the system towards residential away from commercial use. So we need to move away from that, and the only way to do that is to get away from this distinction between commercial and residential use and have just a single price for land however you use it, and that will give us the most productive use, which I think in this case it sounds like would be commercial. On the clubs, I mean, I love those clubs in St James's. I was just at the East India Club today for lunch, where I had actually, I think, some of Lance's wonderful salmon. I'm not certain it's your product, but they're great places. But it's working as designed if rates are rising for those places, because it may very well be completely anachronistic. It may very well be a completely bad use of that land, that very, very scarce resource, for there to be land in the middle of Mayfair used for clubs. Perhaps not, I hope not, because I like them. But what we want is for the price to be passed on to the person who uses it and to reflect demand for that scarce resource. If there was any other resource on the planet where prices were rising and existing users were saying, like gold, if gold was rising in price and people who love jewellery were saying, oh, it's really bad because these industrial users of gold are stopping me from being able to buy jewellery, we'd say, well, good, I want the gold to be used for that jewellery if that's the most valuable and productive use for it. So why should land be any different? And on the final point, it's so important to focus on the taxes that really hurt businesses. Corporation tax is the killer tax, because it means that even if you're not viable now, even if you're not turning a profit now, you expect to make a profit in the future, otherwise you wouldn't be in business. So corporation tax affects all viable businesses. It's a killer because it stops them from getting investment. It starves them of investment from greedy, heartless, neoliberal capitalist bastards who make the system work. We want those neoliberal capitalist bastards to invest as much as possible. It's corporation tax that stops them from doing that. Business rates, they don't care about.
Ian, do you want to...
Yeah, if I can just... I could have so much fun. We really must talk later. If you are purely talking about a market-driven, high street, great. Unfortunately, in Knutsford, I don't have the opportunity to lift the whole structural high street up and stick it in a brownfield site in Stoke-on-Trent. If I did, it might work. But my point is, we've got town centres that are there, with the units that are there, and I think this is exactly the conversation that needs to be had at government level. Do we have a vision, which sounds a bit like your one, which I don't necessarily like, but fair enough, everybody's entitled to their opinion. Do we go that way where it's driven by market and we turn it into more property? The big boys can operate there, so you've got a generic high street pretty much across the UK, because that's what it'll become. And if we're happy with that, purely market driven, super, away we go. Or do we want a little bit more than that from our high streets? Do we want the local shops, the local pubs, the local bars, that community element, which is far less difficult to measure, I agree. But I think if we let all of that go, personal view, I think we're missing something massive. But that conversation, that's exactly where we're getting to. It's fair, market value, great. In that case, watch the high street and see where it goes. Because at this rate, you'll have charity shops and the really big players and bugger all else. Right. Yeah? Or do we want more from Isaac? And I think that needs a really sensible conversation to be had to decide the direction we're going in. It's a choice. And don't kid yourselves, those independent retailers are the barometers of the health of a vibrant and diverse high street. And if you're killing those, that's the route you're going to end up going down, a fairly homogenous, generic high street. And I'm not picking, personal view, I'd rather the other, but that's exactly the conversation we've got to have. And finally, just quickly, Kate's absolutely right. This has all come, it's not just about business rates, it's against the background of all those other costs that have hit retailers in the last couple of years. Yeah. I don't know what, digital tax now, we're now talking about quarterly reports that the account's going to charge for. All of those things, you haven't got, you'd love to pass it on, but I don't think they've got the margins to do it in some cases.
It's a very, very quick one, just to answer back, because there is some new research out this week. Those neoliberal, capitalist, fascist bastards are saying, whatever you were saying, they are now saying business rates are the single biggest barrier to investment in our high streets and in our sector of the economy. It is a barrier to investment. It is hampering it at a local and a very small level, and it's also hampering it at a big macro level. So
I'll very, very quickly get maybe one more question in and run. Yeah, Rory.
Alan made a point earlier about high streets versus online, which is very tempting for someone like me to dismiss straight away as being favouritism for one sector versus another, but I think actually is really important. And for the same reason that, or very similar reason for the point about the charity shop laden high streets that Ian mentioned a moment ago as well. And I think what we need to, what might be driving this is the exemption for charitable properties, and also, as Sam mentioned earlier, the distinction between the incentives that landowners face for residential versus commercial property. Now, property values tend to be highest in the centre, so what that's doing is it's forcing the commercial sector to, or prompting the commercial sector to withdraw from the high street because that's expensive property, and that's being fed through landlords, and to go onto online and out of town, etc.